So, what is the name of the panel?
What's that?
Will streaming take us to the promised land, or will it be a bust? Something like
Kill
that.
us in the process, or kill us in the process.
There you go. Okay, so this is the hot topic of 2014, 2015, where it's going. It is enormously, it's enormous in its impact. It's enormous in its growth. The question is it a cancerous growth? Is it a healthy growth? Is it a little of each? What do we understand? What we don't understand? And what is the misinformation about it? Because we really need to get to know it on many levels, many deep levels, to honestly have a good opinion about how to handle it. It's very emotional. It's very upsetting to a lot of people. And this panel is really here to try to lay it out with no agenda, just here are the facts so we can begin to understand it from a neutral point of view. A very difficult thing to do with very little information about it. And we're very fortunate to have Dick Huey here from Toolshed, who's one of the leading experts in this area, to walk us through it, and he's assembled an all-star cast of panelists, and I hand it over to Dick for his comments. Please welcome Dick Huey.
Everything is free now. That's what they say. Everything I ever done, gonna give it away. Someone hit the big score. They figured it out. That we're gonna do it anyway, even if it doesn't pay. I can get a tip jar, gas up the car, try to make a little change down at the bar. I can get a straight job, I've done it before. Never minded working hard, it's who I'm working for. Everything is free now, that's what they say. Everything I ever done, gotta give it away. Someone hit the big score. They figured it out, that we're gonna do it anyway, even if it doesn't pay. Every day I wake up, humming a song, but I don't need to run around. I just stay home and sing a little love song, my love and myself. what you wanna hear. You can sing it yourself, 'cause everything is free now. That's what I said. No one's gotta listen to the words in my head. Someone hit the big score, and I figured it out, and I'm gonna do it anyway, even if it doesn't pay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. That was Gillian Welch in 2001. She was responding to the whole advent of Napster. And by the way, I use that music with permission, just in case there's anybody in here that was ready to call me a hypocrite for streaming music for free at a panel about artist revenues and label revenues. So let's talk about what's happened since 2000, how far this industry has moved. The music business is clearly in the middle of a seismic shift. We've gone from selling discs to selling digital downloads to selling access, in the middle of a transition to selling access, often funded by advertising. And all of this has happened in a very short space of time, courtesy of a friend of mine here on the panel, without the benefit of a pause button. It's just happening. Music industry is awash in think pieces, and on any given day, you could read a piece predicting doom and gloom, that everything is going down the tubes. The next day, you might read an article that talks about the other side of the picture and how rosy and cheery the situation is, and how much opportunity there is for individual artists. So the question is, of course, or the questions are, who's right? Or is everybody a little bit right? We're going to talk about some of that today. I wanted to start out talking about an article by Pitchfork editor Mark Richardson. He wrote an article recently describing the lay of the land, I guess, as he saw it, and saying that it's always been very hard for artists to earn a living in music. And he's right about that. I was band manager for years, and none of the bands that I worked with really earned a cent from sales of music. On the other hand, it was a different time. They had advances from the record label. They had tour support, something that's rarely offered anymore. So it was a different time, but it also points out the difficulties in sort of comparing what happened in the past with what's happening now. Having said all that, it is clear that there is a sector of the artist collective and label collective too, and even support industries that are having a really hard time under the current model. So we want to try to go through what's happening. I've assembled some amazing experts in this field. I'm really, really pleased with the folks I've been able to put together. I'm going to start with just a really quick introduction of myself. I used to be head of new media at Beggars Group in the late 90s when new media was just getting started there. And for the last 14 years, I've run a new media consultancy that is focused on these kinds of issues: on-demand streaming, DMCA or radio streaming. I was on the Sound Exchange board for 9 years. And also did content acquisition for Spotify before they launched in the United States. So I have a lot of different positions on this issue, and so do the people on the panel here, but I don't think any of us are predisposed to a particular ideology. We just want to talk about what we found. We want to talk about data. We want to talk about, or I want to talk about things that they've written in some cases, and really try to come away from this with a sense for whether streaming will scale, whether it will become a revenue opportunity or not. So I'm going to start directly to my right with Frank Woodworth. Frank, I'll let you jump in if you want to add anything to the introduction here. So Frank, I've known for quite some time. I was first introduced to him by means of an article that he wrote for Hypebot, TechDirt? Okay, yep, Hypebot. In 2011, before, or right after Spotify launched? Right after Spotify launched. He's worked at the record label 11/7 Music, and Frank he's worked with hundreds of artists in that capacity. Motley Crue, Godsmack, George Clinton, direct fits for the music in this room. He's currently vice president of Thrillcall. It's a tech startup dedicated to providing fans the most accurate live music information, and he has his own consultancy. His Twitter handle is @GlacialConcepts, if anybody follows those things. Do you want to add anything to that? Okay, great. All right, next over, Rasmus Rex. Rasmus is a fellow at the Rhythmic Music Conservatory in Denmark. He has written a remarkable paper, I think, based on actual streaming data from one of the streaming music services. Streaming music service WIMP, which has been launched over here as Tidal. It's a lossless streaming service, so it sounds as good as your CDs, arguably, or better maybe in some cases. Rasmus is going to talk about his paper and talk about his conclusions for a different way to distribute revenue other than the way it's distributed right now. Let's see, who do we have next? That guy, Jim Mahoney, longtime associate. Jim is the US General Manager of Merlin. Merlin is a not-for-profit global digital licensing agency that represents the world's leading independent record labels, the vast majority of them. Jim's background includes being vice president prior to this of the American Association of Independent Music, A2IM. And he has a long history, a 20-plus year career in, president of Fat Beats Records and Distribution, senior director of urban product development at Roadrunner, and national director of marketing and promotions at Profile Records. And, would you like to add to that? Did I forget anything?
I'm not on Twitter.
You're not on Twitter. Okay, and Rasmus Rex is @Rasmus, R-A-S-M-U-S, Rex, for his Twitter handle. And at the end, we have Bob Belden. And Bob is probably the one that most people in the room here know best. His history is legendary. He has worked with an incredible slew of artists in the capacity of a producer, arranger, band participant, artists small and large, from Sting to Dinah Reeve to Herbie Hancock. He has a long history in production and has produced many of your favorite box sets. And he'll present what I expect to be the artist perspective in this particular discussion. Anything you'd like to add? Great. Okay, let's go. We'll leave time at the end for questions. We have a lot to talk about. Would you grab that for me? Thanks. All right, let's start out and talk about the lay of the land before we even get into digital music. I'd love to have anybody who'd like to comment on the panel, maybe Bob would be a good one, or Jim, to talk about the world of jazz, sort of where it exists in the broader music pool. what kind of unique challenges and opportunities exist for this genre of music, and just sort of lay out the groundwork before we start talking about streaming.
Jazz statistically is pretty much right above polka. However, the jazz influence in music is like a 95%. It's just in a genre, in a commodified genre, specific genre, that's laid down, and this product represents jazz. It's a very, very tiny aspect of the world global merchandising market. But in terms of the concept of jazz being limited to that, it's not that way at all. It's just in terms of financial security, it's pretty weak. And it's never been, the strongest it ever was in the 70s when it mixed with rock. It's called fusion music. It was like 8% of the market at its top. And now it's 2% or something like that, according to statisticians. But also jazz is a mom and pop business. It's a artist do-it-yourself business. It's a regional business. It's a local business. And it's hard to quantify the mass of jazz that's everywhere in the world. Far more prevalent than pop music because it's not word-based. It's based on emotions and feelings, and it relates to the globe. In terms of the digital world, it's meaningless. iTunes, it's meaningless. It has a very small footprint because they can't make money off of it in the ratio you make money from popular music. Because it's kind of a specialized area for people. Greatly so, because you don't want, it can't dumb itself down to the point where it's indistinguishable from pop music. And that's the dilemma it faces. Does it grow artistically as well as technologically and within society? And this is what we're faced with Spotify. It's a classic case of all these little tsunamis all merging at the same point. Because I think Spotify and the whole digital thing really emphasizes how minuscule jazz is in the global marketplace. Because the pop models don't really apply. I mean, you would know more about that.
Yeah, Jim, do you want to?
I was just going to, but I don't have an expertise in jazz, just an admiration. And I've read, right, and we were just joking before that I think that if you ask that question of a jazz creator audience outside of the fusion era, in the 1950s or 1960s, what's the outlook for the financial success of jazz? Everyone who makes jazz music for a living would have laughed back then and said none, because the pop model always existed, right? And so jazz artists and those who are looking to make a living from jazz always had the same demographic problems. My fans are the last to adopt to new models. It's why jazz, for instance, didn't do well in the download model, maybe because that download was just a transitional configuration. It was never meant to last in the first place. It was just to teach consumers that you didn't need to hold music to own it or to access it. And so it set the stage for streaming. So I think that, having had a background at A2IM, which is a trade organization of all independent labels in different music genres, I had the opportunity to speak with folks from the metal world and the blues world and the Americana world, and they all would focus on how different they are from everyone else and why specifically the new model won't work for them. And so we actually have a whole lot more in common than with one another than not. But moving forward, I think there, like any other time in our history, there are opportunities. They're buried, and I'm going to expect Barney Fields to come and slap me shortly because I know what he thinks about this world. But because of the fact that it doesn't lend itself well to a pop model often, mainstream media outlets had always kind of skewed away from jazz, so that you couldn't really point to, except for a Sunday morning program somewhere, you couldn't point to the opportunity for your music to be heard. And I think in the streaming digital economy, there are those opportunities. It's not a lean back experience. You're not going to just release your music and have people play it. But to the degree that it's worth your while, and this is what you want to focus on, there are at least opportunities for you to engage in the best practices that are out there and conversations about best practices to, promote your music on these platforms and then therefore make revenue from it.
That's a great background. And that, I think the next step for us is probably to jazz is 6% of streaming. Jazz is 6.06%, excuse me. Of streaming from Nielsen.
Go sit in that.
Thank you for that statistic. Let's actually talk about the digital side. And again, here I want to sort of lay out the land before we delve too deeply into the issues. So, digital music has had, and more specifically, digital downloads, if we're talking about the on-demand piece of the puzzle, has had about 10 years to build its business, relatively unimpeded, arguably impeded by physical sales, but not really impeded by the streaming world. Obviously, it's only been in the last year or two that streaming has started to make an impact. So I guess I'd like to question our panelists about the legal digital music services and how effective they were over the last 10 years at exposing jazz, and talk about whether there were illegal opportunities that exposed it better. Was there, maybe if we can just talk about who does a good job, does iTunes do a particularly good job at presenting jazz? Does HD Tracks do a particularly good job? Who's really good at it and who isn't? Or is anybody good at it? Can any of you comment?
I'll make a comment about in the legal side I helped shut down.
Okay.
It was a guy who had put down the entire Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, Impulse, and Crisscross catalog, every record up. And it was done in a beautiful way. You saw the album, it had liner notes, it had the personnel, the recording dates. It was better than any other big record company could possibly put together. And it was put together by a guy who was a colorist for a digital video editing company whose office was right next door to the American Federation of Musicians. So the irony in that alone was just, and I sent it to my school and I said, wow, free music. I said, don't shut it down until I pull everything off. But they shut it down. But it was better than anything any of these other companies could come up with. I'm not going to tell you who the guy's name is, but he, I said, if they'd have co-opted this guy, they could have increased their visibility in a positive way because he knew the digital world far better than they knew. He knew how to present it and how it had to look physically. And all these record companies, just like you might as well be on eBay.
Right. Who does anybody from the audience want to jump in? Anybody have any opinions about this? About a particular platform or digital music service or presentation of jazz that you thought was particularly compelling on the net? Is there one? Is there one? Who? Sorry? The Blue Note Records app. Any others? So I take it is the consensus that the point was, a great point was made that this gentleman goes to YouTube to find his music. Everything's there that he looks for or wants, and you're right, it is all there. And that's YouTube is one of the areas that we're going to talk about a little later on in our presentation.
Dick, can I hop in and ask? But I mean, because you talked about downloads and streaming services, and I go back to the history again and think, did physical retail do a great job of platforming jazz? I mean, there were certain stores. Again, I'm a novice, so take it easy on me. But you could go into the Virgin Megastore on Union Square and find a pretty good jazz section. Although I don't know how deep it ran into, anything more than the surface that the average American male needs to own, like a Miles Davis set or a Coltrane. But I don't know how deep it got. And so again, I would again sorry to come across as the streaming apologist on this panel, but think, you know, without having to be an expert on jazz or investing a lot of money in the purchasing of a big repertoire, including what would have been available via download, if I'm having a dinner party or a lounge-like party at my house, I can go to my Spotify account with my Sonos speakers and look for a playlist of jazz music. And again, I won't know what to select, so it's experts who are filling these playlists, and the music then can get played. So I think that that would be one case for saying streaming actually platforms jazz well, but is the jazz community, the artists, the labels, the experts, making sure that when I go searching for a jazz playlist, the right music is coming up?
Can I say something? I have a thought. I think most of us here, at least I am, are musicians. Is that right? Musicians, a lot? I see 5 experts from the recording or whatever industry talking about presentation, this and that, and what looks better, where can I find something? That is not my problem. My problem is, my music is out there, and people can find it on YouTube wherever they want it, but I have no income from it. That's...
We're going to get to that.
Yeah, but that is 90% of what interests us.
We still have a lot of time.
You know, we can also waste a lot of time because it doesn't really matter how it is presented and who is better than somebody else. That's peanuts. We are not here to improve the streaming industry and the visibility on the net. It's there. That's there. We want to know, I want to know, is this legal? Can this go back to times when actually record sales were in hands of one record company and a download was from one person to another? You know, from one cassette to another, or in the early days of computer, you could burn one CD. That was legally overviewable. Now we are at an age where my stuff is on YouTube. How did it get there? That's, I think...
Lawyers.
Have you, sorry, we have another question.
Yes, the issue of it being on YouTube.
We probably should, yeah, here, let me do it this way instead. Let me have you talk into the...
Phil Donahue.
Being on YouTube for an artist, I know that I've gotten a lot of jobs that way. People who are interested in hiring me to do a gig may have gone on YouTube and seen me. So they will, you know, look at it and they'll say yes or no, they want to hire you for a gig. And with YouTube, you can't really download somebody's music, you know. When you put it on SoundCloud and Spotify and these kind of things where people can get the artist's music and have it for their personal use and listening pleasure all the time is a major issue. In my case, I have a new release coming out next week, and last week someone had it, a used copy that was illegal to be sold that had probably been given to a reviewer, on sale online for $6.99. 2 months before that, one of the reviewers, okay, who has an online radio broadcast, put it up on his blog, and anybody could download it for free. So these are the kind of things that really cut an artist out of being able to make a penny back from the major cost that they spend making a record. YouTube, I really think, is a good thing because a lot of people want to hire you, and if they don't know what you look or sound like, they can go there, it's available, and it's free for them, and it doesn't cost us.
Right. So I'm familiar with these problems, as are all our panelists.
Can I'd like to respond to that. So if you got a job from Spotify, would you feel the same way as YouTube? It's still, you got no money, but someone was exposed to your music. What's the difference?
Yes, I don't have my music on Spotify, because from what I understand, Spotify plays your music, but you don't get any residuals, okay? And that does bother me if I don't get residuals for something like that, and they're selling or having people have access to listening to it on a playlist all day. That's not the kind of place that somebody really goes to give you a job, because not only do they want to hear you, they want to see you.
Just a quick FYI, respectfully, Spotify, depending upon the licensing term, Spotify tends to pay a little bit more than YouTube on a per play basis.
But you think YouTube doesn't pay anything anyway. Right. So to you, it's nothing. And
It was free advertising.
so it's the visual component.
Promotion.
give me 1 second. Let me just say something first. So it's important to distinguish between two types of activity, streaming activity on the net. One is what's called UGC, user-generated content. It's a criteria for music use that is part of YouTube. What it basically means is that users are able to upload music. And that contrasts with a company like Spotify or RDO, where any music that is in that service has been licensed from somebody. So if your music is there, the only reason it's there is that somebody licensed it. It wasn't uploaded by a user. So it's very important to make that distinction before you even sort of move forward further in the conversation.
Yeah, once your music is in the hands of the big corporations, you have no control over it. You know, I have all these records on Blue Note, and they're all on Spotify. And I owe them so much money, I'm never going to see a penny from it anyway, so why should I care about it? But if you're...
I don't think that's the problem. It's even if it's...
Let me let you talk into the microphone if you want.
What's the price of fame? I mean, that's the problem. If you're going to go into this business, in how much money is it going to cost you to become world famous or known throughout the world?
First of all, one word that I cannot hear anymore is the word exposure. You know, everybody says it's great exposure. You are on this and that, it's great exposure. It's exposure that somebody knows me, and if I'm very lucky, I get a physical gig out of that, which is a good thing, and I appreciate that. But the fact that days I have 24 CDs out by now, starting out with Concord in the early 90s, in the first 10 years, I got actual royalties. Composers' royalties to BMI, ASCAP and German Gamer, and Harry Fox royalties because my music was legally controllable. And I benefited as a composer and as an artist. This is over. That's what pisses me off. And
I mean, what you're really...
Instead of hearing various variations of how in the digital world something is presented or not presented or better presented or findable or whatever, I don't care. I want, last end. If something is legally uploaded by Spotify or something else or wherever licenses, I would like to get a fair share. That's it.
Right. So I mean, so we're talking about, you want to.
Thank you.
I agree with you, by the way, that exposure is fantastic. But what about the money? But respectfully, I'd say that like part of the conversation about creating revenue from Spotify is to get jazz in the streaming space to above a 0.6, right? And so one of the great concerns I have that lead, back to the question of how is jazz presented, and is it presented better on this platform or that, is that, hang on, that while we, and when I say we, I mean artists and independent labels, are still having the conversation about the revenue model and the royalty and so on and so forth, the majors are busy gobbling up the shelf space. They're buying the recommender services that feed and populate these playlists. So once again, even if you have your music licensed and on Spotify and you're looking for that revenue, the shelf space, the digital shelf space are these playlists, and the majors control how that music's getting played. If you're talking about the individual per song royalty, we have to look at who's licensing on your behalf, and are they asking tough questions and negotiating hard enough for you. I don't know who currently licenses on behalf of you, sir, but you should definitely have a conversation with me because I represent a group of people who didn't like the terms that they were being offered, banded together, and tried to exert their market pressure to get better licensing terms.
Thank you for that.
So it's not like we don't hear you, it's just we're trying to set up the conversation.
Yeah, but one last thing, and then I'm up for all the day. What about the pop stars like Pharrell Williams and what's the thing?
We'll get to the. I promise we'll touch on that.
They have the presented numbers, they have the streams, and they get whatever $4,000 for 50 million streams.
They've also delivered confusing information. In that particular case, they're talking about songwriter royalties, correct? Not sound recording royalties. Completely different thing, as you know. So this is a conversation that's a difficult one to have because it's complicated. So let's start out. Now that we've established the lay of the land, we've spent enough time on that. Now I want to talk for a second about the different income streams and what revenue amounts we are talking about. So let's have any of our panelists, and I'm looking at your name as Brandy Wood. Frank and Rasmus, maybe you guys want to talk a little bit about what streaming services do pay and how they pay at the moment. And we can talk about on-demand, and anybody else that wants to jump in with respect to radio compensation. Let's just get out on the table what amounts we're talking about, and then we're going to dig into those and see if we can either slice and dice them differently, or if we can find ways to improve the models. So,
can I throw a suggestion that whoever does offer whatever they're going to offer, make sure you specify whether you're talking about a songwriter royalty or a master performer royalty?
Yes, that's a great suggestion.
And remember, when you put out LPs and CDs, the sidemen got royalties if the sales were over a threshold, and that's all gone with streaming too. So the enhancement of the income stream down from the artists has disappeared in this streaming model.
Well, for this, I mean, I think that, and I don't have these numbers off the top of my head, mainly because they change all the time. It's fractions of a penny. No matter what it is, it's always fractions of a penny. Be it YouTube, be it Spotify, be it RDO, be it Pandora, be it terrestrial radio. It's always fractions of a penny. And so it really becomes a different conversation about, what can you do what's the aggregate of those fractions of a penny? And that's why we're talking about bringing it up to 0.66%. I think something that could be helpful, and I'd be happy to do this and then send it to everyone who was here, of just run those down, so you could have it and you could look at it when you're going through it. But again, it's just always fractions of a penny. To speak to what you were talking about earlier, where your music was on YouTube and you're not getting paid for it, that's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, where anyone could upload anything, and then it's the burden on you to have to take it down. And and they're going to redo the Copyright Act, in the next 2 years or so, and they've been having a lot of hearings about that. And so that'll change. And as a jazz lobby, if you're against that, you should talk about that. About how that should be changed. Because that clearly, to me, that's your main point. You're saying, I didn't put it there, but it's up there. And I get a gig out of it, cool, but it's not anything. And to your point that you like it, I don't know, did you put your music up on YouTube?
Me?
Yeah.
No, yes, I do have some of them. My piracy that I'm really upset about is when they take my records, my CDs, and they sell those. They put another cover on it and just resell it.
Well, her issue is physical piracy, which I think that, that's a different panel.
It's a different panel.
So I sympathize with you, but I don't think that's what we are here to talk about today. So that is a criminal matter. None of this is criminal. This is all legal, and it's what's been agreed to. And you have the right to say, I don't want to be a part of it. But if this is how everyone is going to access music, then you're also saying, I don't want anyone to hear my music. And the question becomes, what can be the ultimate amount of revenue that you can get? And I know Dick has that set for a little bit later in the presentation. But
I do, but this is probably a good time to raise the question. And I'm focusing in the early part on this very much on sort of on-demand streaming, and I want to move into some of the other areas as well. But let's talk about one of the things that I'm sure if you've spent any time at all online reading about streaming that you've come across is that we're in a transition. We're on a rope swing, so to speak, and we're swinging figuratively from the tree that housed digital downloads over to the tree that houses streaming, or that is access, where you pay a certain amount per month, or you access music for free and it's funded by advertising. So that's a long rope swing, and there are literally people dropping off the rope swing. So let's talk for a minute about what happens when we do get to the other tree. And this is one that I want Frank to speak to, because Frank has done an analysis. He did a very early analysis on what the marketplace would look like if it scales the way everybody says it will scale. So would you like to give us some background and
Sure.
take that?
Yeah, and Bob keeps telling me that I have to let you guys know what scale is it's not a musical term. But I think, it just means grow. Once we reach, a certain amount of people using something, so just growth. So what I looked at is this, because I love to listen to music. I have tons of albums, I have tons of CDs, and and I'm signed up for every single streaming service. I don't know why, but to check them out and to just be exposed to different things. There's so much amazing music out there, and I personally like streaming because it exposes me to things that I wouldn't otherwise find. But I also work with artists and need them to get paid, or else I don't have a job. So how do you get them paid, and what is the potential here? Because streaming in America, at the time, was about 1% of households were using streaming, and it's not much more in terms of paid subscription. There are people, and I think this is another problem as well. The streaming services have to. That's for another time. The streaming services have to have a service so great that people are willing to pay for it, and we've agreed collectively to let them do it for free in terms of advertising revenue, and split that. To get people using it. And that's important, but at some point, it'll switch. And once it switches, every streaming company said that they would pay more per stream. And that's what we're all focused on. I'm sure you've heard 200 streams equal 1 download, or 50,000 streams equal an album, or 1 million streams equal $1, whatever it may be. What is it really? And the answer is this. Let's see. On an individual play, your total payout is, again, fractions of a penny, 0.033 to about 0.077, which is terrible for an individual play. But then you have to look at how long people play music. If streaming becomes the dominant form of revenue, or of listening, that means people will be streaming instead of listening to the radio. That means people will be streaming instead of playing a CD. And plays per month per household are about 2.5 hours of listening per day, if you were to put that. I know some people listen more, probably most people in this room listen more, but that's what it ends up being. And so because of that, you're talking about trillions of plays overall once more people start adopting streaming. The benchmark for that is Netflix. Netflix has about 30 million households right now. And that is probably at most what different streaming services collectively could make.
So why don't you add to this conversation the piece about what that would likely translate into in terms of overall revenues? Sure.
So at 30 million households, per month revenue would be $344 million. Your yearly revenue is $4 billion. So that becomes your recorded music threshold. You could probably throw in a little bit more here and there, because there are still people who are going to buy physical CDs and physical albums. So I still have vinyl and I'll still be collecting it. But that's it, $4 billion. That's at $10 a month. If it raises to $20 a month, it doubles, and so on and so forth. So that becomes a question about what's valuing music.
It's also important, can I just interrupt with one thing? It's important to point out that we're now talking about one piece of the streaming world, the revenue that comes in from the streaming world. We haven't yet added in sound exchange, for instance, which is another piece of the streaming world, and which will next year come very close to, if not hit, $1 billion in distributions. So it's very important when you're hearing numbers like $4 billion and you're thinking, well, the size of the recorded music industry is $7 billion now, so that means we're going to go down $3 billion. It's very important to collectivize these revenues and think about them in the aggregate. And if anybody in this room is not participating in a piece of where the revenues in this area come from, that's arguably part of the reason, probably not the whole reason, but part of the reason that your revenues may be less than what you are expecting.
And that goes across the board. And you know, just to take those numbers more, you know, if 30 million households are using this, and let's say you have a huge hit, whatever the song may be, like, you know, Candle in the Wind in 1997 or Stairway to Heaven in 1971, or something that everyone listened to, you know, they can make about $41 million, you know, because there's this is scale. Like, if everyone does something, you can make more money than you've ever dreamed. And that works for jazz as well. It's not going to be $41 million. But if everyone who likes jazz, who is on a streaming service, listens to it, your revenue will be more than it is now selling physical.
By the way, this isn't new, right?
No.
Being paid percentages of pennies isn't new. It's lasted as long as there's been songwriting royalties, right? And scale was the key to it as well. Because every single play that a songwriter has played on the radio doesn't generate a lot of money. But it's the fact that it gets played in bars and restaurants and he gets some money, and it gets played on the radio and he gets some money, and it gets played in the background of an ad and he gets some money. It got sampled or re-recorded and he got percentages of pennies. And so scale is the key to all of it. And the industry that we've all been a part of for as long as we've been a part of it, the cliche existed that, you know, the way to get paid in the music industry is write a hit song. It was never perform a hit song. It was write a hit song. And the streaming economy, as Frank is talking about, it could become possible that the cliche could be amended to say write or perform a hit song.
Does anybody, and would anybody like to, we've as you can see, we're starting to dig in on the different pieces of the universe that contribute to overall revenues in the digital streaming space. There are some notable omissions. Terrestrial radio, for one. So terrestrial radio is a huge notable omission that has for years claimed that the promotional value of what they do absolves them from having to pay a sound recording royalty in the States, only in the States, and one or two other countries around the world. It's for the streaming economy to take the right shape, that has to change. I don't know if anybody wants to add any thoughts to this, but it's the sum of all of these parts, and any one individual part of the equation that gets a pass is detracting from the overall revenue package, or the overall revenue opportunity, I should say.
History of the cable industry, they started out with subscriptions at like $8 a month when they first started. And now you have to take out a loan to pay your monthly cable bill. So in 10, 20 years, Spotify might charge people $50 a month for premium service for things like new debuts of new music, like a week ahead of everybody else, private shows, live streaming concerts. So they're not going to get cheaper, especially if you've got Goldman Sachs and those people involved. They're going to get more expensive because they're going to monopolize a portion of that business, and then when they have a market share, then they can raise prices. Whether jazz benefits from that, we don't know. But nonetheless, we're not going to make any less money than we're making now, and I don't think we're making any less money than we're ever going to make, because the bottom is pretty much bottomed out.
It does get back to how, you know, who presents your music best and who presents jazz best. Because, for instance, to your point, even at the current pricing model, I pay for a Spotify account, I pay for Sirius XM, I don't know why, and I listen to Pandora all damn day. And so it's costing me. Pandora's free, but you got performers, if I'm listening to their music, still get paid. So that's $30-something a month I'm spending. I wasn't buying $30 a month worth of CDs. I know I'm not a scientific nor representative case study for everyone. But now, from my $30 a month, what are you making of it? And yes, the royalty rate, the per stream royalty rate and how it gets, figured out is an important part of that, the answer to that question. But it also, hand in hand, is how is your music being presented on the services that I'm listening to.
And that's why we laid the background we did. And Bob, you just gave a great lead in to Rasmus, who I want to bring into the conversation now.
Yeah. That's great.
Sit back, Jim.
4 billion.
Billion with a B.
But that's maybe a key issue. You want to raise that percentage. You want to get a higher market share, because one thing is growing the streaming services and the revenue that can generate, but if your market share just keeps dwindling, you won't be getting that money. So you want to grow that market share. And you asked the question in the beginning, Dick, would this be a good way to earn money? And are the services performing well in presenting jazz? And I'd say if the market share of jazz is 0.6%, then it's terrible.
How can we improve it?
You have 2% of overall album revenue is generated by jazz, and you have only 0.6% on streaming services. Then they are not doing their job well enough. But there is probably a reason for that, because if you look at who uses streaming services, who subscribe for streaming services, they tend to skew young. And if you look at jazz audiences, they tend to skew older. So it might just be a question of getting jazz fans to the streaming services in order to make the jazz market share grow. So you have two aspects of this. You have, on one hand, you want higher royalty rates from the streaming services, but you also want the jazz market share to grow in order to be able to reestablish an economy that maybe was there. I'd like to take just not something that's directly connected to my research, but I just got some numbers directly from the streaming service I've been working with, who's been supplying me with data.
And tell us who that is.
Yeah, that's WIMP in Denmark, which is launched in the fall here in the US as Tidal. They have a streaming service that is subscribed on completely the same terms as Spotify, but they also have a premium service or a hi-fi service that enables you to stream music lossless, which means in CD quality. And what they say is that they present their music with as curated content. Instead of playlists and algorithms as Spotify do, they have editors collecting music and curating that for their audience. And they have one who specializes in jazz, and he has one spot on the front page when you open up the player. And on Tidal, the jazz market share is 1.78%.
And just to clarify, Tidal is the name of the service that's launched here in the US, TIDAL.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about that is if you look at the normal resolution. So what would be normal for Spotify and other streaming services. But if you go to the hi-fi quality, the lossless quality, the jazz percentage market share is 5.25%. So that is more than, it's 3 times as much as for their ordinary streaming service, and it's more than double of what the market share for CD sales is. So if my argument here would be that you have a quality-oriented audience, so you want to present them a way of accessing your music that is also quality-oriented. And a big mainstream pop service like Spotify that is meant for consuming it through your iPhone, through the wide earbuds, that's not necessarily the way jazz audiences want to listen to their music.
The problem with these digital services, especially relating to the jazz fan, having personal experience with producing box sets, the amount of detail you have to put into issuing music to satisfy jazz fans, personnel, recording dates, liner notes, all these extra things that that they kind of, we take advantage, think of as natural, that don't really exist, in the digital realm. Even I talked with Barney Fields about metadating his entire catalog, where you can put all that stuff on files, but there's no interest, it seems to be, in the larger scheme of things, to embrace the traditional desire of jazz fans to have complete information, to have the totality of the experience, not just listening to the song, but knowing about who's on it, and reading Joe Goldberg's liner notes or Cascuna's notes. That's gone. I mean, it's removed the experience from personal to just participatory.
Doesn't that beg the question, though? I mean, many of us in this room, if we're not artists, we might work for record labels, or we might work for companies that are responsible for selling things. Doesn't what you just said beg the question that we need to open our minds and think harder about how to present the things that matter to us in a way that we can? I mean, if the service doesn't offer it, is it, for instance, possible to create a, just off the top of my head, a subscription service on top of the subscription service that delivers something physical, or that ties in with a streaming service and delivers a physical copy of the music or of the liner notes? I mean, there's a tendency inside this industry to sort of, and I bet a lot of people in this room will agree with this, to sort of accept what is handed to them. And I would make the argument that it's up to the people in this room to think about, your work as an artist, how you want it presented, and take the initiative to find a way, using the multitude of tools that are out there. There are a lot of tools that are not streaming subscription services, to augment or to improve the offering that you're putting out in the marketplace.
Bob, how about a microsite? What if everyone put a microsite together that you could look through and see that, and then you play it through the services that are built for that, be it Tidal, be it Spotify, be it whoever. But then you can experience all the liner notes that the artists themselves put out. Would that work?
Well, I mean, it tends to be, if they have a face page for every record you put up or every track that explain what was on the track, and that doesn't work in the pop model per se, but jazz tends to be a narrative kind of art form, and people tell their personal stories and their experiences in their music, and in a lot of cases it would be beneficial to have a literary complement to what's essentially an oral experience. I mean, that's sort of embracing the idea of enhancing as opposed to degrading. But it's already there in a file. I mean, you can put liner notes in any file in the lyrics tab on iTunes. So you can put everything on a file now, embed it with all kinds of information. It's just getting the people who put the files out to say that's necessary.
Well, exactly, like that's not available in those services right now.
Because the people who are the gatekeepers are they're kind of like, how much is that gonna cost? It's like, you already have the information, it's already there in your database. Just how much does it cost to drag and drop? And they just don't want to pay an intern $10 an hour to do it.
That's true.
But it's also a case of not wanting to clutter your interface when you're designing this kind of services. So as long as it's only 0.6% of your customer base that's using that kind of feature, you don't want to spend valuable real estate on your interface for that kind of feature.
But that's where I would remind everybody what I started with, which is that jazz community saying that, well, ours is a different experience. You have in common people from the metal community and the blues community or whatever, and you can use an organization like Jazz Connects to connect with A2IM or other groups so that you, everything today, whether it's in the music industry or in the world, you don't matter individually, right? That's sort of I don't mean to put anybody down if this is the first time you're hearing it, but we don't matter to our president, we don't matter to our local congressman unless we're coming together as a group. And so, I think that you shouldn't just focus on the 0.6. Obviously, you work to try and get your 0.6 up, but reach out to those organizations, organize and collectivize. And of course, this is coming from me, who's worked for trade organizations and the like. But there's value in that collective. Barney Fields, for instance, has an important voice inside of A2IM, and so does Peter Gordon, who was a founding member and served as its president for a while. And it's find out who else would like some of those ideas, and collectively, somebody from the metal community and somebody from the blues community and somebody from the jazz community, go sit your ass down with the people at YouTube or Spotify or for whomever, or WIMP, and say, hey, this is what we think would make us, our listeners really sign up with your service.
So what you're talking about is shaping the conversation. And shaping the conversation, if you're not in the conversation, you can't shape the conversation. So let's debate that. There have been some very high profile, everybody in this room I'm sure has heard that Taylor Swift is not on Spotify. So that's one thing. That's one level of I don't think I should say this at the panel, but it's one thing of sort of sticking it to the man. But what about if you're not Taylor Swift? What is the practical advantage or disadvantage of not participating? I think we should discuss that, and we should also think hard as artists about whether or not the desire to participate in the streaming economy, whether or not we are approaching it in a way that will grow our audience. For instance, look at somebody like Robert Glasper, doing very well from my understanding in the streaming world, and part of the reason is that he is successfully bridging the gap from an older audience to a younger audience based on who he records with. Yes? I figured there would be a comment to that, so of course, but let me go ahead.
I think the general tendency is that in the old days, you were represented by a record company and they did all the work and you were at their mercy what's happening. The tendency is that artists become independent and their own manager, their own president and their own secretary. And that is a good thing because you retain the rights, you make the decisions, but it's also an almost impractical thing to understand the world, the legal side, to understand what we are talking about. That's a lot of stuff is new. Deal with GEMA, deal with BMI, deal with whatever, hire a publicist. This is all, in the end, it can also turn out very nice because as an independent artist, you retain the rights. That's a good thing. That is a very good thing. But you have to be able to manage them and do something with it. And I don't think it's a matter of not being willing to speak up or participate. It's almost a extra education besides studying your art is to do all this.
You're absolutely right. It's
the education system in the music world in the United States de-emphasizes the understanding of anything but music. So the business, the legal, the entrepreneurial aspects are not part of music curriculums. And then when they come out of schools or they launch themselves into this world, they suddenly have to be held accountable for that.
I would disagree with that. I know my school, I have a music industry degree, and many of the musicians there did as well. And I think Berkeley does a nice job of
But the majority of jazz colleges in the United States do not. Because the universities, you have to be a business professor to teach a business course. They won't let somebody who's not a business professor teach that course. So you can have an industry professional, he can't be a business teacher there. He has to have a degree, a master's degree in business administration or some form of business. At North Texas, where I graduated from, they do not have anyone whatsoever discussing the music business. They never had, because they can't get a faculty member over from the music business, from the business department to teach music business, because they don't know about it.
I think that's an anecdotal.
No, I know exactly from that school. They do not have anybody teaching. The faculty doesn't even know about compulsory licenses.
Having said that, though, to take Frank's side for a second, I personally have spoken at a variety of University of Chicago. I'm going to go speak at Drexel next month. I've been down to Loyola. And these are all places that have...
In music industry courses?
In music industry courses.
Yeah, music industry courses. I think he's talking about music master,
You're talking about the business
in jazz
of music.
schools, because we're talking about jazz people here.
Right.
When you go to a jazz school, Berkeley, yes, it's a trade school. They don't have, you can't take English literature at Berkeley. Well, I mean, you can, but I mean, it's, you know, you can take it to other schools there. But in a sense, you have these music business programs, which is where the tradition. I know, but see, Berkeley's an unusual school compared to any other school in the United States. You got to know that. Most other schools do not have any functioning business program whatsoever.
That's true.
And I know a guy at the University of Illinois.
Berkeley does, and we have a liberal arts department. We're a regular four-year college. I just had to jump in, so that we wouldn't have misinformation in the room. But otherwise, I would have let it slide. But no, we're a four-year college. We have a liberal arts requirement. You take English, you take math, you take everything else like that you would take at a normal college, and you take music. You have the opportunity to take business classes. I'm the chair of the jazz composition department. We have many teachers at Berkeley who teach music business, and our students are able to partake in those classes.
So could we all agree that like it's missing from the curriculum outside of Berkeley from most music degrees?
Oh, yeah.
Not music industry degree, but music degrees.
Yes.
And maybe that's something this group could collectivize and start to talk to universities about making it part of their curriculum because, not only do you need these days to learn how to create your music, you better know something about the business of music as well.
Yeah, Berkeley's an anomaly. It's totally different than a traditional four-year
Either that or it's the
state's
leading
college.
edge.
Pardon me?
It's either that or it's the leading edge.
Well, it's always been the leading edge. I mean, but you're dealing with now this influx of students coming out who are probably participating in this, who come through the system putting records out by the score, and are having the same issues that we're talking about today. What is their future going to be? He's got a lot of records out, and he's having trouble getting revenue from them. Imagine a young musician who puts his heart and soul into a CD, and he sees nothing coming of it, and he knows forever nothing's ever going to come from it. I mean, that's a pretty...
So there are two topics I still definitely want to hit, and then we're going to go to Q&A. One of them is that one right there, which is what should be the expectations of somebody young in the business, starting out in the business, in terms of revenue generation versus, and don't slay me because I worked for an independent label for 15 years, so versus promotional benefit. And I argued against that as much as anybody in this room, I bet. Maybe even including you. But I'm going to ask the question seriously. The challenge, I think, right now in the music business is in sorting out how to keep, as we're sort of swinging across the gap between downloads and access, between physical and downloads and access, how do we keep the people alive while they're on the vine, okay? So in order to keep them alive, I would make the argument, controversial or not, that the money that is in the business needs to focus on the mid-level musicians and on the upper-level musicians who are professionals in the field, who make their living from music. If you're at the bottom, and I say this as an ex-manager, you're not making money from music. If you are making money from music, you're not at the bottom. That is the way it works. And I'd like to sort of segue from that point to you finishing up and talking about sort of questioning the models for payment or for the receipt of money from streaming music that we have now. Rasmus has done a very in-depth study about a different way to slice up the pie. So we have two pies that look identical. Right now, one of the pies is sliced up pro rata. That means that each play of music generates the exact same amount of money. It doesn't matter if it's your play or my play, same amount of money. But what if you looked at it from a different perspective? What if you looked at it from a per user perspective? What if you said, whatever you stream gets distributed to the artists you listen to, and whatever I stream gets distributed to the artists I listen to? So why don't you talk about that real quick? And
But can I just start out by doing something a little bit different? It's
Yes.
closely connected to the thing you said here.
Go ahead.
Because most people tend to think that streaming is a blockbuster model. So that the ones at the top are taking all the money and the rest are getting nothing. And to a certain degree, they're right. We have 20% of all music on Spotify has never ever been played. Not even the rights holder had done the effort to go in and see if it played and see if it works. So a lot of music is there, but nobody listens to it. In the data set that I had from WIMP, which is 1 month of full streaming data from the Danish territory where I'm from, top 1% of the tracks that were actually streamed accounted for 70% of all revenue. Now that sounds incredibly high. It is incredibly high. But we have to remember that there are 20 million tracks, it's 24 million tracks now on Spotify and WIMP, on these streaming services. So if we try to boil that down to what would be available in a well-assorted record store, it's nothing near that. That would be about 1% of what would be available on Spotify or WIMP. So we have an explosion in availability of different music, but that doesn't mean that people want to listen to it. And it also means that the top 1% that accounts for 70% of all revenue are actually the professionals or semi-professionals that would be present in a well-assorted record store. If we look at only the top 1% of the top 5,000, artists, which would be equivalent of roughly of what we would find at this well-assorted record store, top 1% would account for 28% of revenue, which is still high, but which is lower than what we find in physical sales. So looking at it from one side, we could say that it is a blockbuster model, but we could also say that streaming actually benefits the long tail of music. The issue that arises from that is that the ones that are suffering from the entrance of all these new artists in the long tail, that's not Taylor Swift. That's not the top level artists. That's not the superstars. People who want to listen to the really, really obscure music would be the audiences that would usually, in the traditional model, have been listening to rather obscure music. So people if you are in the tail or in the middle section of artists, you are competing with amateurs. And that's a huge problem. But is it the problem of the industry, or is it the problem of the streaming services? I would say no. It's the problem of the artists. It's because it's just basic competition. You have amateurs entering the market, competing with professionals, and the distinction between those two are falling apart. So, but one thing I did was I tried to build on that and try to think: can we slice and dice the revenue from streaming in another way? Is it possible to distribute it from other principles that are still objective, not something that where you sit on an individual basis and say, this is a quality artist, I want to send money in their way, but is it possible to do it in a different way? And one thing that's always puzzled me about the way the revenue is distributed from music streaming is that you pool everything together and then you pay out per market share. So money from everyone in this room would go into the same pot, and then each play gets a share of the revenue equivalent to their market share, their share of total plays that month. That means effectively that if I listen a lot and someone else, Frank, doesn't, Frank is effectively subsidizing some of my consumption. He's paying, some of his money goes to the artist that I am listening to instead of going to the artist that he's actually listening to. So it would be possible to distribute according to a per-user model. So my money goes to the artist that I listen to, and Frank's money goes to the artist that he listens to. The interesting thing about this is that it does not favor quantitative listening. So if I listen to a lot and Frank listens less, Frank isn't subsidizing my listening, he's only subsidizing the artist that he's listening to. And if Frank listens only to one artist for 1 month, all his $10 minus 3 for
Minus the 30%.
minus
that is earned
30%,
by
yeah,
the service.
would go to the artist directly.
Okay,
Or not directly, but through the record
so what
company
you're
and
saying
through
is
the-
these subscription fees are monthly blanket license fees. So like a blanket license for ASCAP and BMI, they don't individually mark what songs were played in the restaurant. They just say X amount of money coming in, we get this amount of money, and we distribute it amongst everybody, regardless of whether they play your song 1,000 times in that restaurant. That's a blanket license. So in a way, this is a blanket license, and jazz never benefited from blanket licenses anyway. I mean, all public radio stations were blanket licenses.
But it's not a blanket license in the sense that think of it this way. You have $10 for subscription fee. You take away $3 of that, you have $7 left. If I stream one artist, that generates $7 in revenue, which goes to that one artist. That is very different from a census collection of data, which is you take all the money in the pot and you distribute it out pro rata.
The subsidy of one and another is sort of the effect of a blanket license.
That's
Right.
the current status.
Yeah, that's the current.
That's the current status. So we're talking about doing something different here.
But jazz has always been essentially under blanket license in the United States. And, having seen minuscule radio royalties,
The reason we're presenting this, just to make it clear to everybody here, is not because what Rasmus is presenting is likely to happen tomorrow, but rather to get everybody in this room thinking about what do I have to do to impact the discussion? One of the things you have to do is think about it and think, how could we change the discussion collectively as artists, collectively as labels, to change things. You've got some very big, powerful players at the top of the industry that are not going to be in a rush to change anything at all if it doesn't benefit them.
Another thing you can do then is your responsibility to do, if you're concerned with the royalties, is ask the difficult questions to those who are in charge of signing off on the licenses that are determining your royalty rates. And so I don't know your business, sir, but if you're not happy with those royalty rates, I go back not to promoting my own company, but somebody's making these decisions, right? And so I won't touch the part that Dick just talked about, that the major labels are, no matter what service we're talking about, they want to eliminate risk. I said I won't talk about it. So they're not interested in who you listen to versus who you listen to. They want theirs up front. They want their guarantee. But the fact that the rest of us all fall in line lays in the laps of each of us, that we are distributed by label X, Y, or Z, or distributor A, B, or C. And when our music ends up on Spotify or RDO or YouTube or any of these services, that we're not asking to see the deal terms, that we're not asking, how did you arrive at these royalty rates? That we're not asking, Billboard magazine wrote an article a few weeks ago about how one of the majors was the first to license one of the world's biggest sharing and promoting free sites, right? And in the first sentence pointed out that one of the big aspects of the license is that the major label was going to get a discounted share price in which they could then invest in the company. A company that, if you know what it is, and I just don't want to name it here, but is built to flip, right? So what are the artists on that label, and what are the artists that are distributed through labels through that major? What are they going to get when the payoff comes of that discounted royalty, that discounted share price? And what did the major label have to give up in terms of a per stream royalty to get that discounted share price? Those questions need to be asked by all of us. It's cool to look at different economic models, and I think that brainstorming that stuff is all valuable, so that's why I wouldn't shoot down the conversation. Except it ain't gonna happen in hell because the majors aren't gonna do that kind of thing. But I don't want to shoot it down. But nothing will change until independent artists, independent labels, artists in general, and independent labels are asking those very difficult questions about, I see my royalty statement, how did it arrive at that figure? And how did you sign off on something like that?
And in order to get into that conversation, and we're going to go to questions after this, I apologize, there's so much stuff that we still haven't covered that, but in order to get in that conversation, artists have got to centralize around somebody, a leader somewhere, who can drive your discussion forward. Because look at who you're trying to get in the room with. You're trying to get in the room not only with Merlin, but also with the major labels. And in order to do that, you need to have some collective strength. You can't have 15 different organizations all trying to do the same thing. You gotta have one. And you gotta find a leader who can present your case for you. Let's go to questions.
Hi, my name is Sherry Winston. I'm a jazz flutist. And I have 6 CDs on the market. 3 of them I did through small independent record labels. 3 I did on my own. And my question for the panel, and I guess anybody else out here, I know a lot of artists are in the same position that I'm in. The 3 that I did on my own was very costly, not only in terms of producing the records, paying for studio time, my musicians and everything else, and then doing all the radio promotion. I spent 13 years in the record industry as a record executive, so I know how to promote records and call radio stations, which I did on all of the 3 records that I produced myself. Well, I produced all of them, but that's besides the point. I'm talking to Dr. Jazz, who most of you all know today, and he says, okay, Sherry, when are you doing another record? And my answer to him was, I'm probably not. And he says, why not? I said, I can't make any money off my records. If I'm spending $25,000 of my own money and I get streaming revenue and I've got a royalty statement 5 times the size of my arm and I look at the bottom and I can't even pay my electric bill on it, I'm saying, why am I going to put out another CD when if I have to send something to somebody as a sample of my music, I can already use what I have? But what is that doing to me as a writer, as an artist? I'm still performing, but I have no desire to make another record. And what is that doing to all of us that are independent artists that want to continue to write and put out our own records? Why should we keep doing this? That's my major question.
Okay, so anybody want to pick up that question?
You do it because that's your life. You know.
Yeah, but I can perform. I don't have to write and put out records.
I know. I mean, again, sometimes you don't have to do it. I mean, nowadays, does a record generate gigs? I mean, it used to be you had to get a record to get a gig, but I'm not so sure if that's the same thing anymore. I think it's just a matter of just doing your thing and keeping at it. Because I've given up on the record business as far as revenue. I mean, it's just a nice beverage coaster you hand to people. But also, I think personally, it's better to be in partners with somebody and not do it on your own and not put any.
Well, it's not because I wanted to do it on my own. I mean, who's getting signed these days and by whom? And if you do get signed by an independent, the last 3 independent record labels that I was with, I never saw a dime from it. I mean, they would give you a big excuse about all the promotion that they did on it and the record reps that were running around and whatever. And being in the industry on the record side, I know these people weren't spending any money on the records, but I never saw a dime from it.
It is a cynical way of looking at it, but there's a portion of the music industry that's powered by the fact that we know artists don't create because they want to, they create because they have to. Like it's in your being. And so that's going to create product that we then can eat off of, that you ate off of too when you worked in the music industry.
You do it for the music, that one. They take advantage of that.
They do.
Yeah.
We do.
Well, is the answer that we have to stop making the music then?
Well, you said that you didn't make any music the old way. You didn't make any money the old way either.
No, I didn't say that.
Okay.
No, I made money.
We got to kind of move this
from-
one along, only because we only.
I'm sorry.
They don't
It's a
give up.
great question.
From record
we
sales.
only have
Just to
3 more
answer
minutes.
Frank, no, I did make money from live gigs and selling my CDs after the gig. Yeah, I definitely made money that, but it
But I
wasn't
mean
through
from record
companies.
sales. You didn't make money from a record company, and you're not going to make money from streaming either. Exactly, okay.
And you never made money on the back end because the accounting structure was such, you're always in debt.
Right, exactly.
I think our message throughout has been the answer to your question, which is don't give up, get collectivized and start speaking as a voice about the royalty structure that exists today.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Mark Patterson. It seems to me like Taylor Swift's point is the money ain't enough. Using your math, if the Spotify company is making 2.5 cents for each play, I did a little math, and they're paying out 0.033, who's making all that extra bread, and who decided it should be 0.033, and why can't a bigger percentage go to the artist? How do we get to that point?
Publicly on the record, Taylor Swift's label is Big Machine Records. Big Machine is distributed by Universal. Universal is the world's largest music label, and they're the big dog in the tent. And so they and the digital services, and it was a piece of convenient PR that they picked one service because that service was the one they pulled off of when her music was available on services that I know pay less. So there's a lot there, but who decides? The services together with Universal, and then they go to the next biggest and to the next biggest and on down, right?
But if it ain't worth it for her, it's worth it for no. She's the number one in the last year.
She's pulling off of Spotify because she's ready to sell her catalog?
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot at play there.
There's a lot of things at play, and I also think it's important, really quickly, to make the point that if you're not making money on streaming, be careful at pointing just at streaming. It's like I said before, Robert Glasper, like I said before, there are artists who are very successfully moving into the world that Spotify is creating. Many of them, and I hate to keep picking on Spotify because we had so many others to talk about, but it's not just a function of what they pay. It's are you relevant? Are you relevant to the audience that is represented by that service? And if you're not, use it as a promotional vehicle and focus instead on what your product is. Use it as a way to build your touring audience. You can do it. A lot of artists have done it. There are some very, very successful case examples of artists who have utilized on-demand streaming to build their touring audience. It can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done, and there are examples all over the web if you look for them.
I'll give you an example of YouTube. I know a record company executive, works at the big company. He signed a group because they had millions of YouTube hits, and they're going by that to sign artists because they have visibility. And they might not have made a penny from those YouTube hits, but they got a six-figure record deal.
Yeah,
so again, you can't monetize every aspect of what you do, especially if it's jazz in a world that doesn't care about it. You can monetize yourself as a human being because people can relate to the human experience. But we're trying to get money out of the air, and it's just not there anymore. It was never there.
I'm afraid I have to let that be the last word. I'm really sorry I couldn't take more questions. Thank you for sticking with this and for listening to us. Come on up afterwards and ask questions, although probably not right here, maybe over there somewhere. And thanks again for coming.
Major